Will Howard had a chance to boost his draft stock at the NFL Combine, but he may have raised more questions than answers.
You are Locked On Buckeyes, your daily podcast on the Ohio State Buckeyes. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome in, Buckeye fans, to another episode of Locked On Buckeyes, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. I'm your host, Jay Stevens, also the host of the Jay Stevens Podcast. And joining us here on a Tuesday, it's my favorite NFL draft analyst. It's Ryan Roberts. He was down in Indianapolis for the Combine, getting to talk to a lot of people and hearing some things behind the scenes going on with a lot of Ohio State players and other guys that will be drafted. And we didn't touch on Will Howard on Monday, and I wanted to say that for today's show with Ryan, because what a lot of people saw from Will Howard at the Combine was a throwing performance that wasn't efficient. It was pretty poor. And Ryan, when you throw like that right after having a year where you have multiple games of throwing over 80%, people will wonder, is this the real Will Howard, or is what we got during the regular season the Will Howard that's going to be in the NFL?
Yeah, I mean, so I would say this is that anytime we're talking about combine performances, we do have to remember that this is a resume building process, and this is a part of the resume, right? Like the full resume is not what he did in a 10-minute throwing session. The whole resume is what you put on film, medicals, character, interviews, and then obviously the on-field things that you did in Indianapolis. So like it's all a part of the resume. So did it hurt him a little bit that he didn't throw well in Indy? Slightly, right? It's not nothing, but it's not like he went from a potential second-round pick and now he's going round 6 because he looked really rough throwing the football in Indianapolis. This is just a part of the equation. It's a part of the resume, and it's something that teams will have a part of this full evaluation process in the end.
That's a good thing to say, because as a lot of people know, when you think about a bad performance at the Combine, well, you're thinking, well, the last Ohio State quarterback that threw in the Combine was C.J. Stroud, and he threw out of this world. But Howard and Stroud are not the same type of throwers. They're not the same type of quarterbacks. He was really efficient this year, way more efficient than I expected, maybe even than you expected, because I know before you were not on the Will Howard train, and I don't know if you are now. I'm curious, though, has Will Howard done enough in the season to get you to believe in him?
I mean, believe in me, because I think we talked about it in the season, or maybe during the season. I believe in him to be a potential good backup quarterback. And I kind of always felt like that, right? Like at least a solid end backup quarterback. In this process right now, if I had to kind of put a round grade on him, I think he's going to go probably today 3rd to 4th rounds, right? Like I don't think that he's a second rounder. I definitely don't think he's a first rounder. I think he's going to be drafted to be a high-end potential backup, to be a guy that can also develop maybe into something down the road ultimately. So I'm on a similar wavelength to the NFL. I think that there's going to be some media out there that are going to talk about, since it's not a great quarterback class, that he should be a guy that's in like that top round conversation. But I don't necessarily see that. And I didn't hear anything in Indianapolis that makes me think that necessarily NFL teams believe that. Ultimately, though, he brings a lot of good to the table, right? Like he's got a bigger frame. He just won a national championship. He played his best football down the stretch against the best opponents that he saw all season. So there is a lot to like about Will Howard, but he also has deficiencies, and we saw that during the throwing session. I don't think he drives the football incredibly well. I don't think he has a great arm just overall. I do think he's more of a rhythm-based passer that needs to be in a constant state of comfort to be a good player overall. So it doesn't change my opinion. I don't think many people around the league have a very different opinion than what I kind of just shared there. I think he's viewed as a potential late day 2, early day 3 quarterback that has some traits that will allow him to stick on the next level.
The thing you discussed about him not really being able to drive the ball down the field very well, that I think was one thing we saw in Ohio State's offense throughout the regular season, because they weren't doing that. They weren't asking him to do things that he wasn't strong at. And they did save his legs for the playoffs. But I think Ryan Day realized this guy doesn't have the arm like previous Ohio State quarterbacks. So we have to cater the offense to him. The film, he's going to have good film when he was at Ohio State. So I can't say like he won't have that.
Yep.
And I want to believe in him, man. Like I want to be the positive guy, the positive person. Like, oh yeah, no, he's going to be a starter at some point. I don't see a starter. I see probably a journeyman like you do. Maybe he does start. Maybe a Gardner Minshew role. He'll back a guy up and the starter gets hurt, so Minshew's there. But I don't know if Will Howard's going to get to the NFL and all of a sudden figure the mechanics out and get the strength to drive the ball down the field like he needs to. But if he does, he could be a starter in the NFL.
Yeah, so the player that I've compared him to, and people find this very disrespectful, but it's been a guy that's been a backup quarterback in the NFL, and he might even be better than this player, but he gives me a Mason Rudolph feeling, right? Of like Mason Rudolph can be a good backup quarterback. And honestly, when Mason Rudolph's gotten some chances, he hasn't been awful. Like he hasn't at all, right? So maybe he's a better version of Mason Rudolph, but like just the physical perspective kind of gives me very similar traits, right? Like Will's probably a little bit faster than Mason, but Mason had a big body. He didn't have a great arm though, but he threw a pretty deep ball like Will Howard has done during his course of his career, especially at Ohio State this past year. And so I think he has every possibility to stick on the next level. One spot, if I get into a little bit of a tidbit, and I was told that a couple teams are pretty high on Will Howard, or when I say high, again, like I'm talking borderline top 100 type of talent, not a guy that's going to go in the first round. But I was told that the Pittsburgh Steelers are a team, and I put this in an intel piece this week for A to Z Sports of like everything I've heard from the combine and things that I trust coming out of Indianapolis. And I wouldn't be shocked at all if somewhere third to fourth round, the Pittsburgh Steelers are a team that like Will Howard a lot amongst a couple others.
That'd be good for him getting to go back to his home state of Pennsylvania. It'd be bad for Browns fans, that also Ohio State fans having to go against that guy a couple of times a year who also could be playing with Justin Fields. I don't know if Fields has a new team or not.
So that's a part of the conversation point is so Pittsburgh is going to explore the veteran quarterback market, but a part of that veteran quarterback market is Russell Wilson.
Yeah.
Bringing Justin Fields back. And then, so I think the Steelers' main topic will be bringing one of Russell Wilson or Justin Fields back. Which one? I have no idea. There's conversations about both. And then going into the mid-quarterback market, mid-round quarterback conversation. So I wouldn't be shocked at all if we go fast forward to 2025, Russell Wilson or Justin Fields. One of those two is the starting quarterback for the Pittsburgh Steelers, and a Will Howard is the main backup with the potential to develop behind those guys.
Let's stick right there for a little bit, Ron, before we get off of Will Howard's train. When you compare those three quarterbacks, who do you think is the best passer right now?
Russell Wilson has to be, right. I mean, I know he's old and he's getting to that point of like of having to have a real conversation about like your immediate future because he's just getting a little bit old in the tooth, and he's had to kind of reinvent himself a little bit because I mean Russell Wilson when he was on Seattle, I mean that dude could move and he could dazzle and he could make some things out of structure. Russell Wilson is a pure structure quarterback for the most part right now. Like he's still a decent athlete, but he's not the athlete he once was. But I mean, we're talking about a guy that's going to make the Hall of Fame one day, right? Yeah. And one of the best passers that we've seen, over the last like 10, 15 years. So I still think that he is the best passer of that group. I think the interesting conversation is from an accuracy timing perspective, who's the better passer right now, Justin Fields or Will Howard? Because Justin has a much better arm than Will, right? Like it's a much more natural as far as like just a pure arm strength perspective. But Will Howard, timing wise, accuracy wise, it's a very unique conversation in that point.
I agree with that. I think we'll also agree that Trayveon Henderson helped himself this past weekend in Indianapolis during the Combine. We'll dive into number 32 next. This episode is brought to you by Supply House. Get the supplies you need from the site made for the skilled trades, Supply House. Whether you're in plumbing, HVAC, or electrical work, Supply House is the reliable way to order products online. Their easy-to-use website is packed with helpful resources and the latest product info to help you get the job done right. Plus, with a complete inventory of over 200,000 parts from 400 plus top brands, you'll find exactly what you need delivered fast from coast to coast. Need help with an order? Supply House offers expert support and industry-leading service, so you'll always talk to a real person. And for trade pros looking for an extra edge, their free Trade Master program offers exclusive perks like a dedicated phone line, free shipping, and discounts on every order. Join the Trade Master program today at supplyhouse.com/TM and start ordering plumbing, HVAC, and electrical supplies with just a few clicks. Plus, use promo code SH5 for 5% off your first order. That's supplyhouse.com. Ryan, I try my best not to dive into a lot of stuff that happens in the Combine because I do realize it's just a resume building piece, like you mentioned earlier. But when a guy runs a 4.4, a guy has a 38.5-inch vert, was a 10 foot 8 inches on the broad jump, that stuff pops off the screen, and you look on paper and you're like, wow, that stuff's amazing. And it also kind of validates the stuff we see on the football field that this guy is a freak of nature.
Yeah. Nah, he's awesome, man. He really is. I remember talking about him obviously several times in the past, Jay, and it's just like it's all there, right? Like as far as just from an explosiveness, big playability, like that type of perspective. It was always just about can he stay on the field consistently, right? Can he do those things? And he did it this past year. And I think working with Quinshon Judkins obviously is kind of a little bit of a dynamic duo. I think that helped him a lot, right? He was able to kind of pick his spots and to not have to fully carry the load, which I think was especially helpful for Trayveon. But yeah, man, he went to Indianapolis. I think he had a really solid week. It's always funny because Trayveon's so fast that him running a 4.43, some people were like extremely disappointed in it, right? They're like, oh man, he's faster than that. But that's a testament to the talent he has ultimately, right? Like his game speed is tremendous. I mean, that last play against Texas before the second half, like that is Trayveon Henderson at his best. Like that's what he can provide to an NFL team. So tested well across the board. He's a great character. I mean, I don't think anybody ever doubted that, right? Like he was going to interview well. He was going to be able to showcase himself well. Like he's a very religious guy who just is a good overall person. And then from the biggest positive, I think, even bigger than like the testing, was typically you hear negative when you're out in Indianapolis, right? Like who isn't interviewing well, whose medicals might be a little bit of a red flag. I didn't hear a word about Trayveon, which is a good thing, right? So it sounds like medicals checked out pretty well. He tested very well. He's a dynamic, athletic kid who just had a dynamic season for Ohio State and a big reason why that team was able to win a national championship down the stretch. So I think that it's wide open right now for like, I think running back 1 and 2 are pretty much locked in at this point. I think it is Ashton Jeanty from Boise State. I think it's Amarian Hampton from North Carolina will be the guys that I would guess will be the first 2 guys off the board. After that, though, like some people like Caleb Johnson out of Iowa. Some people like Trayveon Henderson out of Ohio State. And there's a couple other guys that are at least in shouting distance of that conversation. If you told me today that Trayveon Henderson is the 3rd running back off the board and somewhere in the top 50 overall selections, I would not be shocked one bit.
I would be shocked if he's not a top 50 pick. Like, and I'm not saying like 3rd running back off the board. I'm not trying to go that far. I don't know as much as you do. But Ryan, I'd be shocked if he was the top 50 pick. I think his skill set and some of the stuff he does easily translates to the NFL. To me, it's almost a no-brainer that there's not going to be a coach, maybe in the early part of the second round, is like, oh, we have to get him. It may not be the highest positional need for that team, but he's so talented and he can literally a plug-and-play guy. You draft him and you can just put him on the field and you can find a spot for him. I would be shocked if he was the top 50 pick, no matter what order the running backs come off the board.
Yep, as long as the medicals are what I think they might be at this point, and weren't a big talking point for teams in Indianapolis, I tend to agree with you because this is a kid that has had a lot of production in Ohio State when he's been healthy. He has big playability. The only thing that might hold him back slightly is if you're investing a very high pick in a running back, you do potentially want him to be the number 1 in the stable, as far as like being an early down ball carrier. I think Trayveon still is more of a mix and match with another guy in the room and be that explosive presence. So maybe that holds him back slightly, but I tend to think when you put everything together, as long as the medicals are good, the dynamic ability of the production and the person more than anything, right? Like all those things together, I would not be shocked if he's running back 3 off the board.
So you mentioned something that was in my head before the show. His best season was when he split carries. Now, I know statistically he had more rushing yards as a freshman than he did this past year, but I think his best ball was when he was splitting carries with Quinshon Judkins, and you got great play from both of them. I always wonder how an NFL team is going to view a guy that's been banged up for multiple years. All of a sudden, he splits carries and he's healthy in every single game. Maybe they want to bring him in and make him the featured back, but then they have a little caution about that because when he's the featured back, he's always hurt. Now, his body, it could be like body maturing, and now his body's more mature. Maybe it's just different things that happen in a season, like crazy accidents, those things happen. But I don't know how NFL teams will view him. Maybe he has to split carries and split time, which is cool. Maybe that's who he is as a running back, and maybe he can't be a feature back. There's a role for him in the NFL, but this year I think it's more what you're going to get from him, the NFL, where splitting carries is the best. If he has to play 16 or 17 games as a featured back, he's probably going to get dinged up 2 or 3 or 4 times in a single season.
Well, I think it's irresponsible for a team to expect that of him ultimately, right? Like if any team is going to draft him to give him 300 carries in a season, in his rookie years, like, whatever, like that's malpractice. Like that's misuse of a running back. Ultimately, this is a kid that can catch the football. This kid that's also a outstanding pass blocker. Like that was the biggest improvement in his game this past year, outside of just staying healthy, was he was a solid pass blocker before this, but like he was one of the better pass blockers in college football this past year. Like he did a tremendous job in that regard. So you're drafting this kid, in my opinion, to be the lightning to a thunder. And the thunder doesn't always have to be like the most touches of a guy, right? Like sometimes the lightning can get the most touches. But what I'm saying is that short yardage perspective, like I don't think that that's going to be Trayveon's game. Trayveon's game is space, right? Like outside zone. Let's get him out. Let's get him a sweep out into space. Let's throw him screens, like that type of stuff. So I think that is what's going to be the big sell. But in today's game where teams love to create and manipulate space to the highest degree, this is a player that I would be surprised if teams don't value him in the modern day of the space game.
What about Quinshon Judkins? What do you think about how he did in Indianapolis?
I mean, he tested really well, but some people were, I don't know if you feel this way, but like some people were surprised that he tested well. And I'm like, I remember watching him. I'm like, I'm not surprised he's explosive. Was that ever a concern to me that Quinshon Judkins was explosive? I question Quinshon Judkins in terms of making guys miss consistently, right? Like being creative, not having to just be a battering ram as a runner, to having some nuance to his game. Like those things I don't really see from Quinshon. But if you ask him to be just a early down runner that's a one cut and get downhill and be powerful and explosive, like, yeah, he can do that stuff, right? Now, I struggle with those players because I do think that sometimes there's a lack of patience. Sometimes he misses reads. Sometimes he just runs into crowds to run into crowds, it seems, like at least on film. So athletically, there's not a concern. Like I expect him to run 4.4 high. And you know what he did? He ran 4.4. Actually, I think he ran like mid 4.4. So like he ran even like a slightly faster, but I expected him to be explosive. I expect the jumps to be good. I expect all that stuff to be good. The question is going to be from the film, right? Like, is this a scheme I don't want to say misfit, because like he did well. Like he was still productive at Ohio State in his 1 year, but like the film, especially against some of the bigger games, I know he had a good run against Notre Dame that really made the stats look nice, but like there were a couple games down the stretch where like he just wasn't incredibly productive, like against Texas. So was that just you maybe weren't the perfect fit for your scheme? Is that you just lacked patience at times? What is fixable? What isn't fixable? Like those conversation points are all important, but like, yeah, he tested well. And anytime you test well, that obviously doesn't hurt your evaluation anyway.
No. The explosive thing is one that I think a lot of people kind of expected from him. I think the one thing that we talk about him and not just running into guys just to run into him, against the better defenses, he really wasn't as amazing as you would think. Nebraska's really good run defense. Ohio State struggled to run the ball. Second half against Oregon in the regular season, Ohio State struggled to run the ball. Now, granted, you lose your left tackle, trying to fix stuff on the fly, but they still struggled to run the ball. There were some times, even before the playoff, that they couldn't get anything going on the ground. Now, I do think some of that is schematic things that shifted, that helped the offensive line, but they couldn't get it done. Mm-hmm. I'm high on Henderson. I'm trying to talk myself into Judkins being a day 2 pick. And it's pretty big. If I got to talk myself into doing that, it may not happen. I may have to change how I look at it. But I see a scenario where somebody falls in love with him because of what he did this past year and says, oh, yeah, he's a day 2 pick no matter what.
It's possible. I mean, you could sell me on him being a 3rd round pick. You could also sell me on him being somewhere early day 3, right? Somewhere in the 4th round range. I think it's really going to depend on just, can teams trust the nuance aspect of it? And nuance not only in just his ability to read and have vision and have patience as a runner, but also be a little bit more used in the passing game. Like he flashed it at times this year as far as like having good hands out of the backfield, but like, can he be a consistent player in that respect? That's what's going to be that's what's going to differentiate between him being a little bit of an earlier pick as a top 100 player or being a guy that's just outside maybe more of a top 125 selection. But either way, I think the NFL likes Quinshon. But the question is he just an early down physical runner, or can he be a little bit more and have a little bit more of a variation to his game?
From one guy that transferred to Ohio State to another guy that's been at Ohio State his entire college career, it's JT Tuimoloau. One guy that I'm high on. I love watching him play, but I have no idea what NFL people think about him. That's why Ryan Tier will discuss him next. So, Ryan, going into the year, I was not thinking that at the end of the day, I would be higher on Jack Sawyer than JT. But here we are, beginning of March, and I've already been on the record saying that Jack's going to get drafted higher than Tuimoloau. And I think Tuimoloau, at the end of the day, is the more athletic guy. Jack was more consistent this past year. The consistency piece for Tuimoloau has always been one that you and I have talked about numerous times over the past few years. Mm-hmm. I think there's a piece of his athleticism that can get tapped into in the NFL. I also think he may have been playing out of position, but I don't know. Like, what from the I know he didn't do anything on the field.
Yeah.
Did that hurt him at all? Let's just start there.
Did it hurt him at all? So I think it's a great question. It's funny because I think we actually see this one a little bit differently, which is funny as far as like who gets picked first. It's interesting. I think it's a great conversation. JT, I wouldn't say he hurt himself, Jay, because so for instance, like in comparison to Notre Dame for a second, right? Because those teams played 16 games or whatever, and they played the latest of any college football player this year and the longest that any player has played in college football. I do think that a lot of teams excused players for not competing at the combine coming off that. So like Notre Dame had 8 players at the combine, only 1 participated in the drills because it was a long season, man. They're banged up. They're getting back. I think as long as JT goes to the pro day and has a solid or good showing, I think he's fine. Like I don't think they're going to hold it against him at all. Sounds like the character stuff is good. Like I heard him, interview, and I'm not shocked at all that he's a good interview and he's a guy that's like extremely engaging. So I don't think he hurt himself at all at the combine. And he measured out pretty well and did all those types of things. I just think that, it was a long season. It was a really long season. Get healthy, get back. And I think that he will be okay in the long run because I do expect him to test relatively well, at least, comparatively to his size. So I think he'll be okay. So I wouldn't say he helped or hurt himself necessarily in Indianapolis. It's kind of like a neutral feeling, if that makes sense.
It does. It does. Ryan, when I think about JT, specifically JT, I think he can play regular, like a DN and a 4-3 or a DN and a 3-4. Part of me has believed over the past year he's probably better being a 3-4 hand in the dirt defensive end and a 3-4 look, which I think while you don't get the pass rush from him like Ohio State fans wanted, I think that would be a great thing for him to go to a team that has the defensive front that fits him the best. Ohio State was never going to a 3-4 or a 3-3-5. Now the personnel they had this past year, this is an opportunity for JT to get into a team that has a scheme that fits him, that allows him to play his best ball.
I think JT is like and it's so much fun to say Tuimoloau, by the way. It's a fantastic last name. But I think that he is one of the safer edges in the class. Like,
interesting.
And I don't think that it's necessarily like he's not the most exciting in the class. Yeah. Like I don't envision him being like a 10+ sack a year guy, like by any stretch, but I think he'll just be a solid starter, man. Like he'll be a solid starter. He'll be dependable. He'll be a guy that can give you a little bit of nuance and juice coming off the edge. And I think he'll do a solid enough job in the run game to be a guy that can start in the NFL. So I don't think he's dynamic. Like he's not going to stand next to like James Pierce Jr. and Abdul Carter and those types of guys and be like, oh my God, look how athletic and explosive JT is. But JT's smart. JT's, he's a guy that brings a lot of solid overall traits to the game. And I mean, he just had his most productive season. Like he led Ohio State in tackles for loss and sacks, and he had a really good overall year, his best for Ohio State, especially down the stretch of the season. So I don't think anyone's going to draft him to be dynamic. I think they're going to draft him to be just a good, solid contributor, a guy that is a plus to the room.
Do you think he could be productive in a 4-3 look in the NFL?
I think that's what he has to be, right? Like he's 6'4" plus, he's 270 pounds. I don't think he's a guy that's going to play in space a ton. So like I don't see him as
right.
I don't see him as a 3-4 stand-up. And I also don't want to put too much weight on him because I do think he's a
Not
pretty
at all.
flexible dude. So I don't want to put him as like a 3-4 hand in the dirt. Like I don't see him as like a 4-4-I type of dude either. I think he is a 4-3 hand in the dirt defensive end, a guy that can play either on the strong or the weak side, depending on how your system kind of operates. He's a hand in the dirt 4-3 guy for me, and a guy that I think could be a solid overall player in that system.
Let's go to Lathan Ransom here really quickly before we get up out of here. There's 15 guys we could talk about, really 17 if you think about G. Scott and Josh Fryer.
No, I'm not talking about G. Scott on this podcast. I'm sorry, I refuse. I'm just kidding.
No?
I'm just joking.
Let's do it right now. No, we'll save it for another day. Lathan Ransom, you loved him. You loved him for a long time. You sent a clip to me at one point. I was like, oh, that Michigan State interception. And I was like, oh, this guy really ran like 40 yards to intercept the ball. The combine is one of those things. Like I watched Denzel Burke do some drills. Like, okay, like I expected you to do what you did, but it also impressed me that no, it's better than what I expected. Lathan Ransom didn't work out. I also don't think he needs to because this film is just insane to watch.
And the bigger question about Lathan was going to be the medicals, ultimately, right? It's similar to Trayveon. Like he's been banged up course of his career. First and foremost, he had a healthy season, and it was his best season in Ohio State by a large margin, man. He was really good. Some NFL teams might disagree with this sentiment. I don't really care what he runs. I really don't. Because you're not drafting Lathan Ransom to be like this ragey center fielder. Like that's not him, right? He's physical, man. He's downhill. He's in the box. He's going to be making plays in short zone. Like I much more care about just kind of the short area stuff, right? Can he change direction well enough? Does he have solid enough closing speed? That's all I care about Lathan Ransom. All I know about Lathan is this. He is going to get drafted in the NFL probably in like the 4th or 5th round, and he is going to play in the NFL for like 8 to 10 years as at least a solid backup safety that's going to play special teams with his hair on fire. Like that's what he's going to be, dude. I love the demeanor he plays with. Do I wish he was a little bit more flexible and a little bit ranger on the back end? Sure. Yeah, absolutely. Like that would make him a top 100 player easily. But he is a guy that has a role in the NFL for sure. A smart, physical dude, downhill, will play special teams. I like a lot of what I see from Lathan Ransom. For me, he's a guy that just makes a team. He makes the team, and he makes the team better.
Do you see any negatives with Lathan Ransom?
He's slightly limited athletically in terms of like pure range. I think he can do enough that he can be a too high guy on the next level. But if we're talking about a team that wants to rotate a ton, there's going to be times where Lathan Ransom is going to get rotated to middle of the field as a true center fielder, and I don't think that's his game necessarily, right? Like I think he's slightly tight comparative to some safeties in this class. I think he's better coming downhill on angles. Like I don't think that he's a guy that's necessarily going to open up on a 45 and work hash to sideline. Like that's necessarily not him fully. But I think he can do enough of that on the next level. But again, if you're drafting him to be a dynamic coverage safety from depth, then you're misusing Lathan Ransom. I want him as a strong safety, a guy that can come down. He can come to cover tight ends at times, and he can be physical. I mean, some of his best reps I thought were when they played against Penn State. Caleb Downs was used in this way a little bit too, but Lathan Ransom had some one-on-one opportunities against Tyler Warren, and in his physicality and the aggressiveness he has, I think that he can do some stuff working down on tight ends, bigger slots, that type of thing. So let's not ask him to do what he's bad at. Let's ask him to, or not great at, let's ask him to do what he's good at, and that's being physical and being a little bit of a tone setter for a defense.
We don't normally talk about Ryan Day on the show. We normally keep it to players.
Oh, no.
But I'm curious as we close up the show. Last thought is from you, Ryan. What are your thoughts about Ryan Day?
I mean, he proved a lot of people wrong, right? Like he won a championship. So at the end of the day, there's not going to be any hot seat conversation in the near future for Ryan Day. Like he won a national championship, so he's got all of that pressure off his back. It's funny what happens in just a few weeks, though, right? Like after the Michigan game, everybody wanted him gone, right? Like they're like, oh, Ryan Day stinks, he sucks, like get him out of here. But then he was able to flip the script, and the fact that you beat the break off of Tennessee, you beat everybody down the stretch, right? And even Notre Dame came back and made it a closer game in the final game of the year, but like that game was never actually that close for 90% of that football game. I mean, they were blowing the doors off of Notre Dame in that football game. I mean, the only close game in the playoffs was Texas. Like, that was the only one until Sawyer picked up the football and ran it back. So he silenced the haters. There's no pressure on him right now. He's a national championship winning coach at Ohio State. Do I still fully buy into Ryan Day as a head coach? No, I actually don't. But at the end of the day, you got the best roster in college football this past year. You hit the home run hires. You did it a few years ago with Jim Knowles, and you got Chip Kelly to come on your offense for a year. You had the best coordinator duo in all of college football. I'm interested to see, though, Jay, because there's no pressure on him. But now the next step, he had to replace a couple coordinators this offseason, right? He had to reload a roster. You just mentioned like 16, 17 guys in this draft. Well, you have to replace 16 or 17 pretty dang good football players ultimately, right? So the short term, Ryan Day proved everybody wrong. Ryan Day has no pressure on his back, but I am still interested to see like a couple years from now, if he doesn't hit a couple good hires, does that pressure come back? Like, we'll see.
I have so much I want to talk about with Ryan about Ryan Day and these coaches that got hired and players that are leaving. Unfortunately, we're up out of time. We're going to do that on a different day. You can follow Ryan on Twitter at Rise, the letter in draft. You can follow me on the same platform at JSteven07. Ryan will be back. He's my favorite NFL draft analyst. We do like tons of shows leading into the draft, and then some of the fall kind of getting a preview of guys and what their projection might be for the NFL draft in the upcoming year. Love having Ryan on the show. Love talking about the Buckeyes, and trust me, I want to get Ryan's thoughts about Ryan Day down the road. This has been Locked on Buckeyes on a Tuesday. We'll see you next time.